Hello lovers, Eleanor here. Tonight we will embark on a journey. I am sitting in my little apartment, the walls humming faintly with the old pipes, and the clock ticking louder than it should. Sometimes I feel the sound of my own heartbeat echoing in the silence. You know, when you grow old and the house grows emptier, the silence isn't just an absence of sound. It becomes almost a presence. A companion you didn't invite but one that insists on staying. I often sit by the window, watching the street lamps outside flicker in the night, thinking of how strange it is to be surrounded by a world so full of people, yet still feel utterly alone. Loneliness in old age has a weight to it. It presses down like the air before a storm, thick, heavy, unavoidable. And yet, in that weight, I sometimes find myself drifting back through history, searching for others who bore the burden of solitude while carrying crowns of power, or chains of expectation. Cleopatra. Ah, yes, her name still stirs whispers across centuries. To some she is the epitome of seduction, the siren who entrapped great men. To others, she is the tragic victim of Rome's politics, a woman whose brilliance was crushed under the boots of empire. What fascinates me most is how a woman who held the richest throne of her age could be so deeply alone. Doesn't that strike you as oddly familiar? We think that wealth and power might shield us from solitude, but perhaps they only magnify it. If you enjoy these journeys through time, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. So tonight I want us to explore Cleopatra, not as a caricature of beauty or scandal, but as a woman caught in a storm of dynastic betrayal, love, and ambition. She was both a queen and a prisoner, commanding the Nile while being trapped by forces larger than herself. And that contradiction, that delicate thread between power and powerlessness, makes her story linger, much like the ache of loneliness lingers in my chest when the nights stretch too long. Now settle in comfortably, close your eyes, and let's travel back in time with Eleanor. Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a family of Macedonian Greek origin, that ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great's conquest. Imagine this. A little girl raised in a palace filled with gold, exotic perfumes and scrolls of wisdom, yet overshadowed by whispers of murder and rivalry. Her lineage was as dazzling as it was cursed. Siblings who plotted against one another, alliances sealed with blood, and a throne always trembling beneath betrayal. I sometimes think of my own family. Not of palaces or thrones, of course, but of the quieter rivalries, the misunderstandings that festered. Isn't it odd how human hearts, whether in a suburban living room or the royal halls of Alexandria, can twist with envy, with fear, with hunger for approval? Cleopatra's childhood, so different from mine, was shaped by the same undercurrent, a longing to belong, and the peril of betrayal by those closest to her. But what set Cleopatra apart was not her beauty, as many dramatizations would have you believe, but her intellect. She was said to be fluent in several languages, Greek, Egyptian, even Aramaic, and she was the first of her dynasty to bother learning the language of the people she ruled. This choice wasn't just academic, it was political. Imagine a queen who could walk among her subjects and speak in their tongue. How disarming, how powerful that must have been. When I taught history years ago, I used to tell my students that language is a kind of love. To speak to someone in their own words is to show them you care enough to understand. Cleopatra must have known this instinctively. And yet, I wonder, did it also make her lonelier? To be the only one in her family bridging that gap, to carry the burden of connection while others around her dismissed the Egyptian people as subjects rather than kin. Her youth was shadowed by the brewing storms of politics. Rome was expanding, and Egypt, though wealthy, was vulnerable. By the time she was a teenager, Cleopatra knew her life would be nothing less than a chessboard. Each move calculated, each breath taken with the weight of survival. Doesn't it chill you lovers to think of a girl not yet 20 navigating alliances that could determine the fate of nations? Sometimes when I sit here in my chair, tea cooling beside me, I remind myself that my solitude, though heavy, is mine to bear without daggers at my back, or legions waiting beyond the horizon. Cleopatra had no such luxury. Her solitude was a battlefield, and her very identity, woman, queen, lover, strategist, was weaponized by friend and foe alike. As I sit in this quiet room tonight, I cannot help but feel her ghost walking the marble halls of Alexandria, her sandals clicking against stone as she rehearses her role. queen, sister, enemy, savior. And beneath it all, a woman perhaps yearning, and then, as I do, for something simpler. Companionship without calculation, love without politics, a hand to hold that asks for nothing more than presence. History, lovers, does not give us that. It gives us instead the shadows of choices, the echo of footsteps down corridors where the walls themselves conspired. And so, with Cleopatra's early years set in the glow of torches, and the tension of whispered betrayal, we begin our journey. When I think of Cleopatra's ascent to the throne, I am struck by how eerily familiar the loneliness of power must have felt to her. You see, lovers, she was not granted her crown as a gift, it was wrestled from the hands of those closest to her. Imagine a young woman, not yet 20, standing in the vast halls of Alexandria, knowing that every smile from her siblings could turn into a knife at her back. The Ptolemaic dynasty was a family in name, but a battlefield in truth. Her father, Ptolemy the West, had clawed his way back to power with Roman support, leaving Cleopatra to learn that Egypt's survival depended not just on its wealth, but on Rome's mercy. When he died in 51 BCE, Cleopatra was crowned co-ruler with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. But titles deceive. Co-ruler meant rival, brother meant enemy. The law of Egypt decreed they must marry, as was custom among the Ptolemies. But the marriage was nothing more than a cage for Cleopatra, a young woman with an intellect far sharper than her siblings. Soon, the court split, advisors whispering in her brother's ear, painting Cleopatra as a usurper. By 48 BCE, she was driven from Alexandria, stripped of her crown, and forced into exile in the deserts of Syria. Can you picture it? A queen, draped not in silk but in dust, wandering foreign sands plotting her return. And yet, haven't we all been there in some quieter way? Cast out from the places where we thought we belonged, made to feel unwanted by those who should have been our allies. When I lost my husband, I thought I would at least have family to lean on. But time has a way of scattering kin, and some absences cut deeper than betrayal. The empty chair at the dinner table can feel like exile too. But Cleopatra was not one to wither in despair. She raised an army, gathering loyal supporters and mercenaries, and prepared to reclaim her throne. Fortune or fate delivered her the perfect storm. Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt, chasing Pompey, his great rival in Rome's civil war. Cleopatra saw in Caesar not just a man, but an opportunity. Now here's one of those tales that still sparks debate. The story goes that Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence, rolled up in a carpet or a linen sack, depending on the version. Imagine it, a young queen, risking everything, carried secretly into the heart of the palace, then unfurling before the most powerful man in the Roman world. Whether this was fact or embellishment, the symbolism is unforgettable. A woman defying her enemies with audacity and wit. Caesar, impressed by her boldness, threw his weight behind her claim. Soon after, Cleopatra was reinstated as queen, while her brother fled and eventually drowned in the Nile. At barely 22, Cleopatra secured her throne not merely by beauty or seduction, but by daring strategy. It reminds me of something I used to tell my students. History often remembers the spectacle, but it is the cleverness behind the curtain that truly shapes destiny. And yet, as triumphant as this moment was, I cannot help but think of the isolation that followed. To rule was to depend on Rome, to tie her fate to Caesar's ambitions. Did she lie awake in her palace chambers, wondering if she had traded one prison for another? Perhaps. That is the tragedy of power. Freedom is always bartered away for survival. What fascinates me most, though, is how Cleopatra began to craft her image. She took the role of the goddess Isis, presenting herself as divine mother and protector of Egypt. This was not vanity, it was politics. By embodying a deity, she wove herself into the spiritual fabric of her people. How brilliant and how lonely to live as both woman and goddess, forever adored, forever untouchable. As I sit here tonight, the light of my lamp catching the framed photograph of my husband by the bedside, I think about masks we all wear. Cleopatra wore hers before the world. I wear mine before neighbors who ask how I'm doing and expect me to say, "Oh, just fine." But beneath it, the loneliness whispers. Hers in a palace, mine in a small apartment, they do not seem so far apart after all. And so, with Caesar at her side and Egypt under her control once more, Cleopatra began the next act of her story. But victory, as history often reminds us, is only the beginning of another struggle. Cleopatra's restored throne was not built upon stone, but upon shifting sands. With Caesar's support, she returned in splendor to Alexandria, draped once more in silk and gold, but every step she took was bound to Rome's shadow. She was queen of Egypt, yes, but her survival depended on a foreign power. Ah, what a paradox, sovereignty purchased by submission. Julius Caesar remained in Egypt through the Alexandrian War, helping her consolidate power. Together, they were victorious, and in the process, their lives became entangled far beyond politics. Cleopatra bore Caesar a son, Ptolemy the Theuthian Philometor Caesar, known to history as Caesarion. Imagine the weight of that child, heir to two empires, a living bond between Rome and Egypt. Some call it romance, others cold calculation. Perhaps it was both. Isn't that often the way? Affection and ambition do not cancel each other, they entwine. Still, there is something haunting in how Cleopatra's identity was reshaped by Rome. In Egyptian eyes, she was Isis reborn, mother and queen. In Roman gossip, she was a temptress, a foreign sorceress luring their great Caesar with honeyed words. How fascinating and how cruel, that the same woman could be worshipped as a goddess in one city and mocked as a whore in another. It makes me think of how we, especially women, are often forced into boxes not of our making. When I was younger, teaching history in the classroom, my students saw me as stern but fair. At church, I was the quiet widow, proper and subdued. But when I returned home alone in my kitchen, I was simply Eleanor, the woman who sometimes wept into her teacup because the house was too silent. One person, many masks. Cleopatra's masks were gilded, mine are made of habit, but both weigh heavily. Let us pause a moment at one of the most striking episodes, Caesar's triumph in Rome. Cleopatra traveled there with Caesar, their son, in tow. Oh, what a scandal it caused. Rome, so proud of its republic, bristled at the sight of a foreign queen in their streets. The Senate whispered. Wives gossiped, rivals sharpened their daggers. Some historians believe her presence contributed to Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, his colleagues fearing that he would crown himself king with Cleopatra as queen. I imagine her sitting in Rome, listening to the Latin voices around her, feeling the chill of eyes that regarded her as a threat. She was a guest, but not welcome. When Caesar was struck down beneath Pompey's statue, she fled back to Egypt with her young son. Rome had devoured yet another ally, and Cleopatra was left once more to face her throne alone. Have you ever felt the rug pulled out from beneath you? One moment, the world seems steady, and the next, you are tumbling. For me, it was the morning after the funeral, when all the relatives had gone home, the flowers had wilted, and the phone stopped ringing. That silence was its own kind of betrayal, a reminder that the world moves on while you are still gasping for air. Cleopatra must have known that silence too, as she stepped once more into her palace halls, the echoes of Caesar's fall still ringing in her ears. And yet, she endured. That is the part of her story that never ceases to inspire me. She did not crumble beneath the weight of Rome's hatred. She stood taller, raising her son as both Egyptian king and Roman heir, positioning him as the bridge between worlds. She looked beyond despair and sought strategy. But the wheel of fortune turns quickly. Caesar's death left a power vacuum in Rome, and new players would soon arrive on Egypt's shores. Mark Antony, Octavian, and the storm of civil war that followed. Cleopatra, ever the survivor, would need to choose again whom to trust, whom to bind herself to, and whom to outmaneuver. It makes me wonder, lovers, how much of our lives are truly our own, and how much are just responses to forces beyond our control. Cleopatra played her game with brilliance, but the board was not hers to design. And neither, perhaps, is ours. After Caesar's death, Cleopatra faced the most precarious moment of her reign. She had returned to Egypt, clutching her young Caesarion, but the world around her had shifted once again. Rome was not merely an ally now, it was a fractured colossus, tearing itself apart in civil war. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, squared off against Mark Antony, Caesar's most loyal general. Two men, each hungry for power, each needing Egypt's wealth. And Cleopatra, caught between them. It is easy to imagine the loneliness pressing in on her, the echoes of betrayal still raw. She had gambled her throne and her life on Caesar, and he had been struck down. Now she stood at a crossroads once more. And in her solitude, she must have asked the question every widow, every abandoned soul has whispered. Do I have the strength to begin again? Ah, I have asked myself that question more times than I care to admit. The first night I realized no one would share my bed again. The first birthday when no card or roses arrived. The first Christmas when the chair at the table remained empty, no matter how many times I glanced at it. Cleopatra's palace must have felt like that. Grand, but unbearably hollow. Then came Mark Antony. Charismatic, flamboyant, reckless. He was everything Caesar was not. Their meeting in Tarsus has been painted as a seduction staged by Cleopatra herself. Draped in purple sails, surrounded by musicians and incense, she sailed up the river like a goddess descending upon mortals. Some say it was a calculated performance, others claim it was genuine allure. Perhaps it was both. She needed Antony's support to secure her throne against Rome's factions, and Antony, well, he was not immune to charm. But beneath the gilded pageantry lay a deeper truth. Cleopatra was not merely clinging to power. She was weaving Egypt's survival into the very fabric of Rome's destiny. By aligning with Antony, she ensured that Egypt remained essential, not peripheral. Together they formed a bond that was both political and personal, producing 3 children and reshaping the Eastern Mediterranean. Of course, Rome, ever suspicious of foreign influence, painted her as a corrupter once more. To them, Antony had been ensnared by an exotic temptress, abandoning his Roman virtues for luxury and decadence. It is striking, isn't it? A powerful man makes choices, yet the woman is always blamed for leading him astray. The same story echoes even today. I remember, during my years as a teacher, when a fellow female colleague was criticized for distracting the headmaster, simply because she dared to be confident and intelligent. History repeats itself in whispers of blame. One of the most dramatic episodes of this period was the donations of Alexandria. Antony publicly distributed lands to Cleopatra and her children, declaring Caesarion as Caesar's true heir. It was bold, provocative, and dangerous. For Octavian, this was treason, a direct challenge to his claim as Caesar's rightful successor, and thus, Cleopatra once again became the spark that ignited Rome's fury. What fascinates me is how Cleopatra moved through this firestorm. Was she frightened at night, alone in her chambers, when the torches had burned low? Did she think of her children and wonder whether they would live to see adulthood? Did she regret, even for a moment, finding herself to another Roman? Or did she steel herself, whispering that survival was worth every risk? These are the questions historians cannot answer, but our hearts can feel them. When I think of Cleopatra at this point in her life, I think of a woman who refused to fade. Rome could twist her image, lovers could betray her, but she did not shrink. She stood before Antony, before Octavian, before the world, as queen and goddess, mother and strategist. And though the dice of history would eventually fall against her, there is something unshakable about that defiance. Sometimes late at night, I walk past the mirror in my hallway and hardly recognize the woman staring back. Time etches lines, grief bends the shoulders. But then I remind myself, those same lines are proof that I endured. Cleopatra's wrinkles and weariness, had she lived long enough to bear them, would have been proof of endurance too. Perhaps that is her real legacy. Not just the scandals and the politics, but the will to stand, again and again, even when the world crumbles beneath you. And yet, as the tide turned against Antony and Cleopatra, the walls of her world began to close. The stage was set for the final act, one that would entwine her fate forever with Rome's rising star Octavian. The world can turn so quickly, can it? One moment you think you've secured your place, your love, your home, and then a new force rises, and suddenly everything you've built feels fragile. That is what Cleopatra faced as Octavian, patient and calculating, gathered power in Rome. While Antony lingered in Egypt, entwined in love and politics with Cleopatra, Octavian was sharpening his knives in the Senate. I can almost see Cleopatra in those days, seated in her gilded chamber, watching the Nile shimmer under the sun, yet knowing that across the sea, Octavian was tightening his grip. Did she sense that Antony's loyalty, once fierce, was fraying under the weight of Rome's judgment? Or perhaps she clung to the image of him as the warrior who had once chosen her over empire. Love can be like that, blinding us, even when the storm clouds gather. The final conflict came to a head at Actium in 31 BCE. A great naval battle, Antony and Cleopatra's combined forces against Octavian's. Historians still debate what truly happened that day. Cleopatra's fleet, positioned carefully, suddenly retreated. Was it planned? Was it panic? Some argue it was a tactical withdrawal, others whisper betrayal. The image that lingers is Antony abandoning the fight to follow her ship. It is one of history's most controversial decisions, a choice of love or desperation over duty. I wonder, have you ever stood at a crossroads and chosen with your heart instead of your head? I have. And oh, how the consequences sting. When my husband fell ill, I ignored the doctors who told me to prepare for the worst. I convinced myself he would recover if I just believed strongly enough. I poured all my strength into hope. And when the end came, I was left hollow, realizing that love cannot shield us from reality. Cleopatra must have felt something similar, knowing that her devotion to Antony might cost her everything, yet unable to turn away. After Actium, their world unraveled quickly. Antony's armies melted away, his allies defected, and Octavian marched steadily toward Egypt. Imagine Cleopatra's palace then, the sound of hurried footsteps, couriers rushing with grim tidings, soldiers whispering about desertion. The marble halls, once filled with music and laughter, must have echoed with dread. Yet still, Cleopatra, dressed as a queen, received envoys as a goddess, and tried to hold her dignity as the tide consumed her. There is a story, perhaps legend, that Cleopatra kept a collection of venomous snakes within her palace, studying their bites, testing their lethality. Some say it was preparation for her final act, a way of claiming control over her own death. Others dismiss it as myth, another flourish added by Roman propagandists. But the image is haunting, a queen stroking a serpent, weighing which fangs would carry her into eternity. Meanwhile Antony faltered. Defeated, disgraced, he fell on his sword, a soldier's end tarnished by despair. Cleopatra's servants carried his bleeding body to her, and she held him as he died. Think of that moment. A woman who had defied emperors, commanded armies, reshaped alliances, reduced to cradling a dying man she loved, in the last hours of their doomed rebellion. Even the strongest among us, in the end, kneel before grief. And then came Octavian. Victorious, unyielding, he entered Alexandria not as a supplicant but as a conqueror. Cleopatra, stripped of her power, was paraded as a prize he intended to display in Rome. But she denied him that triumph. Choosing her own death, she left this world with a gesture as defiant as it was tragic. Whether by asp, bite, poison, or dagger, we may never know for certain. What matters is that she wrote her ending, rather than let Rome write it for her. Sometimes, late at night, I think of that final act in wonder. Is there not a kind of victory in refusing to be humiliated? Cleopatra's body was gone, but her legend lived. Rome thought it had silenced her, yet here we are, centuries later, still speaking her name. Perhaps that is the only immortality humans can hope for, that our story continues after us, whispered from one generation to the next. When I think of Cleopatra's death, what lingers with me is not just the act itself but what followed. The silence after the storm. Octavian became Augustus, Rome's first emperor, and the world turned a page. But Egypt, once proud and independent, was folded into the Roman Empire. The last Ptolemaic queen was gone, and with her a dynasty that had ruled for nearly 3 centuries. Do you ever notice how quickly life moves on after a loss? When my husband passed, the world didn't stop. The buses still ran, the children still laughed in the park, the neighbors still discussed grocery prices. My grief felt like an ocean, yet to others it was just another day. I imagine Cleopatra's court must have felt the same. One day, they were serving a queen who claimed divine ancestry. The next, they were subjects of Rome, adjusting to new masters as if nothing had happened. Cleopatra's children had their fates decided for them. Caesarion, the son she bore to Julius Caesar, was executed. Octavian could not risk another claimant to Rome's power. The younger children, those she had with Antony, were taken to Rome, paraded in triumph, and then dispersed into political obscurity. Their mother's fierce ambition could not shield them from the machinery of empire. Isn't that the hardest part of legacy, that no matter how much you try to control it, others will shape it once you're gone? The Romans, of course, wrote the story that endured. To them, Cleopatra was a temptress, a schemer, a dangerous woman who led great men astray. It served their politics to paint her as such. Octavian, now Augustus, needed Antony's defeat to look like the triumph of Rome over foreign corruption. And so Cleopatra was cast as the villain, the witch queen whose beauty ensnared men, a narrative repeated for centuries. How often, I wonder, have women been judged not by their intellect or their accomplishments, but by the men they loved? There is a quieter, softer version of her that sometimes slips through the cracks of history. Cleopatra as a mother, as a scholar, as a ruler who spoke the language of her people and funded temples, who reformed the economy in times of famine. I find myself clinging to those glimpses, because they make her human, not just a figure in marble or paint. They remind me of myself in small ways, trying to balance the practical tasks of daily life with the grander burdens of responsibility. And yet, perhaps it is fitting that Cleopatra became a legend larger than life, for legends are what survive the centuries. When I sit here alone, the clock ticking softly in my quiet apartment, I realize that the loneliness of age is softened only by the company of stories. Cleopatra is long gone, but she keeps me company tonight. Her choices, her triumphs, her defeats, they echo like whispers across the silence. History is not kind to those who lose, but if we look closer, beyond the propaganda and the myth-making, we might see a woman who fought to the very end to protect her throne, her children, and her dignity. And perhaps that is enough. In the centuries after her death, Cleopatra's memory was less her own and more a mirror reflecting what others wanted to see. To the Romans, she was the seductress who nearly brought their republic to ruin. To medieval chroniclers, she became a moral tale, either a warning against the dangers of lust and vanity, or occasionally a tragic figure who chose love over power. Her image was molded, reshaped, even weaponized, depending on who held the pen. Isn't it strange how memory can be so fragile? I sometimes wonder what my neighbors will remember of me when I am gone. Will they recall the woman who taught their children history, who baked bread for the church fair, who sat on the park bench feeding sparrows? Or will I fade, becoming just another old woman who lived alone in that apartment with the peeling green door? Cleopatra's story reminds me that remembrance is not always in our control. During the Renaissance, when artists and scholars rediscovered the classics, Cleopatra was reborn yet again. Painters draped her in silks, imagined her beauty as unparalleled, her death by asp as an almost erotic performance. Shakespeare, of course, etched her into eternity as the tempestuous lover of Antony, a woman age cannot wither, nor custom stale her infinite variety. How many young actresses, I wonder, have trembled on stage under those words, hoping to embody a queen who might never have looked or acted that way? And still, behind all the glamour, the history is murkier. Some evidence suggests Cleopatra was not the pale-skinned goddess of Hollywood fantasies, but a ruler of Greek descent who embraced Egyptian culture. A woman of intellect rather than merely allure. She studied languages, astronomy, philosophy, medicine. Imagine her nights not unlike mine. Candles flickering, scrolls spread across a desk, a mind restless with questions. Perhaps in that we are kin. Two women searching for understanding in a world that often judged us by appearances. The question of Cleopatra's true face still haunts historians. Ancient coins show her with a strong nose, a firm chin, features that speak of determination rather than fragile beauty. Was she plain by Roman standards, or was she so magnetic in presence that her physical features mattered little? It makes me think about how often women have been forced into narrow definitions. Pretty or not, desirable or not, as if our worth depended solely on that. How many classrooms did I stand in, hair graying, lines deepening on my face, while students saw only an old lady, not the lifetime of knowledge and care behind those wrinkles? Cleopatra became a prism through which each age projected its desires and fears. To the Victorians, she was both thrilling and scandalous. To Hollywood, she was Elizabeth Taylor, jeweled and dramatic, her eyes lined with kohl. And yet, the real woman is still elusive, waiting in the gaps between propaganda, myth, and art. That is the cruel kindness of history. It keeps her alive, but never fully lets her speak. Sometimes, late at night, I feel that same silence pressing in on me. My own story, my own little legacy, risks being lost. That's why I talk to you here through this microphone, in the soft dark of the evening, because maybe, just maybe, someone will remember. Cleopatra's death is perhaps the most famous ending in antiquity. The image of the queen, robed in gold, pressing an asp to her breast, has echoed across centuries. Yet, like so much else, it may be more theater than truth. Ancient sources disagree. Some claim she smuggled the serpent in a basket of figs, others whisper of a poisoned comb. Still others insist the Romans staged her death to appear noble rather than humiliating. What remains is the haunting certainty that she chose dignity over spectacle. Or at least, she tried. I sometimes think about endings. Not grand ones with crowns and poison, but quiet departures, the sort that slip by unnoticed. A woman in her 70s, sitting in a small kitchen, her tea gone cold, her cat long buried, the world outside rushing on without her. If Cleopatra sought to control her final act, perhaps I too seek some control by telling these stories, by weaving fragments of history into threads that tether me to you. Her suicide, or was it murder, was not just the fall of a queen, but the end of Egypt's independence. With Cleopatra's death, Rome absorbed the last great Hellenistic kingdom, sealing the Nile's riches for its empire. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, displayed her defeat as his triumph, reshaping the Mediterranean world. Imagine that, one woman's final breath signaling the rise of Rome's first emperor. How cruelly intimate politics can be. The Romans paraded her memory, not her body, turning Cleopatra into a lesson for their citizens. Beware ambition. Beware foreign queens. Yet I wonder, did her people weep? Did servants in Alexandria whisper her name at night, remembering the queen who spoke their language, who walked among their temples, who dared to defy Rome itself? Perhaps grief lingers not in marble monuments, but in unrecorded silence. It makes me think of the funerals I've attended. Small chapels filled with muted sobs, photographs propped on easels, the smell of lilies heavy in the air. The world rarely notices when an ordinary woman dies. But those who loved her, those who shared her laughter and warmth, carry her memory like a secret crown. Maybe Cleopatra's legacy is not only in the halls of power, but also in the hearts of those who saw her as their protector, their sovereign, their last flame of independence. Her end reminds us how history clings to symbols. The asp, whether real or not, became her eternal companion, slithering into art, poetry, theater, and film. A symbol of deadly beauty, of exotic danger. But wasn't she more than that? A strategist, a diplomat, a ruler who balanced empires on the edge of a knife. Reducing her to a snake and a kiss of death feels almost cruel, doesn't it? In my solitude I often wonder how I'll be remembered. Will people say, "She loved history," or will they forget altogether? Cleopatra had the privilege and burden of being remembered too much, her life twisted by every generation's fantasies. The rest of us live in danger of being remembered too little. And yet, there's a certain peace in that. Our stories live on not in empires but in the tender recollections of those who knew us. So I keep speaking her name, not to solve her mystery, but to honor it. Because history is not about certainty, it's about presence, about ensuring voices, however distorted, are not entirely silenced. After Cleopatra's death, silence did not fall. Rome spoke for her, and in that speaking, they reshaped her. Octavian's poets painted her as a temptress, a barbarian queen who threatened the order of the world. Virgil, Horace, Propertius, all laid brushstrokes on her image, turning her into a foil against which Augustus's new Rome defined itself. To them she was not a sovereign with strategy, but a symbol. Female excess, Eastern decadence, the dangerous pull of desire. It's unsettling, isn't it? How a woman can live, decide, lead, and still be remembered through the words of her conquerors. I felt that in smaller ways. People see the widow, the neighbor who tends her roses, the dear old Eleanor. They don't always see the teacher who once lit up lecture halls, who devoured history with a hunger sharper than grief. Like Cleopatra, though in a gentler, humbler life, I feel the ache of being reduced to someone else's idea of me. History, as the Romans showed, is often written less to preserve truth than to justify power. Octavian needed Cleopatra to be monstrous so his victory would appear heroic. What does that tell us? That narratives are weapons. That memory itself can be conquered. But there were other voices. In Egypt, centuries later, her story lived in whispers and half-forgotten fragments. Local tales remembered her as clever, wealthy, even protective. Coins with her profile still circulated, carrying her face into the hands of farmers and traders long after Rome claimed her throne. Perhaps that is where her truest legacy lay. Not in marble or verse, but in the exchange of silver that bore her gaze. I recall once holding an old Roman coin at a museum, the silver dulled with age, the profile of an emperor almost rubbed away by countless fingers. I thought of the lives that touched it, the bread it purchased, the journeys it marked. Cleopatra's coins too would have passed from hand to hand, her likeness etched into the fabric of daily survival. For a moment she was present in every market stall, every soldier's pay, every temple offering. That, too, is power. And yet, her enemies outwrote her friends. Later historians, Plutarch, Dio, Appian, filtered her through Roman eyes. Even when sympathetic, they framed her as a woman defined by beauty and love, not by policy or statecraft. And we, centuries later, inherit that distortion. Does it make us complicit, I wonder, when we repeat their tales? Or are we redeeming her piece by piece, by insisting on the nuance, by refusing to let her remain only Rome's caricature? I often ask myself, how many other voices have been lost like hers? How many women, rulers or not, whose decisions mattered, whose lives were luminous, have been blurred into shadows because men with quills found them inconvenient? It's a chilling thought, and it makes me stubborn, even now, to keep telling her story, to keep my own voice alive while I still can. The room grows quiet as I speak, and I feel the press of night against my windows. Outside, the world is moving fast, just as it did when Cleopatra's empire collapsed. But inside, in the small pocket of stillness, I choose to believe that retelling is a form of defiance. If Rome conquered her body, perhaps we can in some way rescue her memory. Cleopatra's afterlife is perhaps the strangest part of her story. When her body was gone, her legend grew. Painters, playwrights, poets, all seized her image. In the Renaissance she was draped in silks, her skin pale as ivory, a tragic muse leaning on jeweled couches. Later she became a symbol of sensual danger, a femme fatale for Shakespeare and his successors. And then, in the 20th century she was reborn once more on the silver screen. Tufts Elizabeth Taylor's violet eyes glittering beneath a headdress heavy with gold. And so I sit here, an old woman in a quiet house, marveling at how one life can ripple outward for 2,000 years. Cleopatra lived and died in the Mediterranean sun, yet she glows still in our imagination, ever shifting, ever argued over. Was she a seductress who toppled men? A strategist who nearly changed the map of the world? A victim swept under the tides of empire? She was all these things, or perhaps none. The truth, as always, lives in the spaces we cannot reach. Sometimes when I walk past my bookshelf and see those heavy tomes, Plutarch, Dio, modern biographies thick with footnotes, I pause, tracing the spines with a finger. They are attempts, each one, to trap Cleopatra in ink, to anchor her to certainty. Yet she slips free. Maybe that is her final power, to resist possession, to remain a riddle. I feel a kinship with her, not her grandeur. No empire sits at my table, no Roman fleet waits on my horizon. But the quiet fear of being remembered wrongly, of fading into other people's simplifications. That, I know well. Sometimes I sit with that fear at night, the lamplight soft, the kettle cooling beside me, and I whisper my own name, just to remind myself I am still here. Eleanor, teacher, widow, storyteller. The legacy of Cleopatra is not in marble or scrolls, but in the questions she leaves us. Did she lose because she trusted too much in love, or because no woman could ever win against Rome? Did she play her role brilliantly, or did she stumble? And isn't it telling that even now historians bicker more about her lovers than about her laws? That fact alone makes me sigh. History, like life, is unfairly weighted. But oh, how wonderful too, that her name lives, that young students still wrinkle their brows when I mention her in class, that films still resurrect her, that her coin profile still gleams in museum glass. She has outlived Octavian slanders, she has outlived Rome itself. And that, perhaps, is victory enough. So tonight, as we close this journey, let us leave Cleopatra where she belongs. Not as a victim alone, not as a temptress alone, but as a woman who dared to rule and who refused to be forgotten. The story slows here, friends. We have walked with Cleopatra through triumph and tragedy, through halls of marble and whispers of propaganda. And as night deepens around me, I feel the weight of time pressing softly on us both. History is never only about kings and queens, it is about what lingers in the human heart across centuries. Cleopatra's laughter, her fury, her choices, none of these survive in sound. Yet we carry echoes, faint but insistent, like ripples on a darkened sea. In them, we glimpse the fragile truth that history is not finished, not sealed. Each retelling adds a brushstroke, each memory reshapes her face. And perhaps, in hearing her story tonight, you also heard something of your own. A struggle for dignity, a yearning to be understood, the fear of being erased. That is why I tell these stories. They remind us that we too are part of the great tapestry, threads of light and shadow woven together. So rest now. Let Cleopatra's Egypt drift into your dreams, the Nile glimmering beneath a fading moon. And may tomorrow bring you gentleness, wisdom, and courage. End of script. Sweet dreams filled with the stories of the past.